In my time running this channel, I've reviewed a ton of different controllers, all the way from Switch controllers to Xbox controllers and different versions of them. And one of the biggest things that I get a little skeptical about is getting cheap gaming controllers. And the reason for that is oftentimes the hardware, the joysticks, the connectivity seem to have issues. So recently a company called Dyonder reached out to me and sent me a PlayStation/PC gamepad. And one of the things that immediately went off was, is this going to be a cheap gaming controller that barely performs? And in this video, I'm going to go through and answer that question and let you know if it's worth spending the $30 or so on this controller, and if it's worth having for either your PC or your PlayStation. So let's take a look. So out of the box, what you end up getting is essentially just a connector wire, which is just a USB-based wire, as well as a little manual, and of course the controller itself. I wouldn't argue that the packaging is anything special, but in my opinion, that's kind of irrelevant if you're looking at getting a straightforward, cheap controller or additional controller for either your PlayStation or your PC. Now, one of the cool things about this product is that the device itself has a bunch of different light up spaces on it. So in other words, it sparkles or flashes, between each piece of it. You can also change the settings so the actual lighting or RGB lighting changes to solid different colors that fade and move and that sort of thing. But I thought, as far as aesthetics go, I thought the controller itself looked pretty good, and it's about the same size as a PlayStation 4 controller, and it feels pretty good in the hands, although it does feel a little light, but to me that's kind of a minor thing. Now, one of the biggest things out of the gate with this that I realized, as I've used many different Xbox controllers on my PC, is that connecting a PlayStation controller is a little different. So I did realize that Steam does natively support PlayStation 4 controllers, which is great, but that's about where it stops. All of the other games that I had on my computer, almost none of them would recognize or accept this controller for input, especially on games like Gears, which is my gold standard for what I test all my controllers on, it seems like. And so I had to go through a bunch of different websites, Reddit forums, and finally figured out how to connect the device to use it with games like Gears of War. And I used a program called DS4 on Windows, which essentially allows the controller to be recognized as an Xbox controller on the computer itself. So that, once I put that in, it seemed like this controller was immediately recognized with all the games that I was going to test it with, which were primarily Gears of War, among others. And out of the gate, one of the first things that I was a little concerned about is the joysticks. So I found on some of the cheaper controllers or cheaper alternatives, even back in the PlayStation days when I was still gaming heavily on that console, one of the biggest issues I had with third-party controllers was the joysticks always seemed to be off. And so I tested this for quite a time over the past couple days, and I would argue that that's not the case with this controller. The aiming felt smooth, it felt very good, and in a lot of ways I thought it felt just as great as using a standard official PlayStation controller. So that to me gets an A+ right there. And the other thing as well is the triggers themselves. I was a little worried that because the controller felt a little light, that they wouldn't perform as well as I expected, but I'm happy to report that the triggers and the bumper buttons felt very good, and they felt tight when I used them for aiming and shooting, and overall I was happy with how that felt. And of course all the other buttons generally feel good. They're spaced well. Again, they're based off of the PlayStation 4 controller, so they're pretty close, and I thought that they felt relatively good. Now, one thing I will mention, however, is that the controller itself, it does have vibration features in it, but I would say that's probably the biggest weakness with this controller. I felt like it was just a little too light, and it felt like the motors in there were either not set to vibrate as hard or just not designed to vibrate as hard as a normal PlayStation controller would do. And that to me was probably the biggest knock at this controller so far. And further to that, one thing I do also want to mention is there is a touch screen or touch panel, I guess you can call it. Touch panel is probably the correct name on the controller. Of course, I don't actually have a PlayStation 4 to test this out on. However, I was able to realize that if I clicked it down and moved my finger across, it would act as a secondary mouse for me. And I guess if that's a feature that you may want or find, or you might like it when you're sitting on your sofa, it seemed to work quite well, and it seemed to be relatively smooth as touching a touch panel would go versus a mouse. And so I will report that that does work as well, and it does seem to work well, but I can't tell you how well it works with PlayStation-based games with that feature. Now, the last thing I do want to address is the actual battery life. So this device, I charged it pretty much out of the box, and I've tested it over the past handful of days. And in my testing, I'm currently looking at the battery life. The DS4 program actually shows you how much battery life is left, and I'm at about 80%, so that's pretty good as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to tell you that this is going to go for 40 plus hours, but if we're talking a couple days of excessive use and I'm only at 80% battery life, I'd wager you're going to easily get 20 hours on a charge with this controller. So for longevity and gameplay, I would wager that this is going to last you quite a bit, and you're not going to have to worry about constantly plugging it in or constantly docking it to charge, which is one of the things that I really like about the Series Elite controller, is that it has a great charge and you rarely or seldomly ever have to go dock it or put it on a charger. So as far as a gaming controller goes, you're not going to get any more features beyond the standard features of your joystick, your different triggers. You're not going to get back paddles, which some people are adamant about with their gaming controllers, but I'm not so sure you have to. And I'm saying that on the context that this type of controller is a cheap alternative to the standard PlayStation controllers, and it has the cool light up features on the controller itself, and it only goes for about 30 bucks. And I would argue that the target demographic for this is someone who wants a gaming controller for their PC, or somebody who wants a secondary controller for their PlayStation because their other one's broke, or they don't have a secondary controller. And I would say at that price point, this controller does everything it's supposed to do, and it does it very, very well. And so for 30 bucks, I would say if you're looking at getting a gaming controller for your PC or your secondary controller for your PlayStation, you can't go wrong with this device. And again, I would say that as far as how everything feels, I'm completely satisfied. So I don't know how many other people have actually used this controller. I don't see a ton of videos on this product on YouTube, but as it stands, I think it's worth looking into if you want a cheap alternative to what's out there.